Paris, 1971. A city of lights, but on one summer night, a terrible shadow fell across its cobbled streets. Behind a locked door on Rue Beautreillis, Jim Morrison's voice of rebellion, the Lizard King himself was found lifeless in a bathtub. No autopsy, no investigation. Just silence, secrets, and a grave that left more questions than answers. Did Morrison really die that night? Or did he vanish into the mystery he always seemed destined for? Janis Joplin's voice was more than sound. It was a storm, a confession, a cry pulled straight from the soul. She sang with no mask, no armor, no hesitation. And yet, for all the fire she gave the world, there was always a fragility behind her. Eyes, a loneliness that fame could never erase. On October 4th, 1970, that fire went out. A hotel room, a cigarette left unsmoked, a needle by her side. The world was told it was an overdose, another victim of excess, another star who burned too brightly to last. But those who knew Janis, those who heard the joy in her voice just hours before, could never quite believe it. Her death felt unfinished, unresolved. A soul cut off mid-song. Why did her dealer disappear the same night? Why were pieces of her story missing, lost between the police report and the truth her friends remembered? Was it just bad luck? A poisoned batch of heroin making its way through? Los Angeles. Or was there something darker pulling her toward her end? Janis was only 27. The same age as Jimi Hendrix, gone just weeks earlier. The same age Brian Jones had drowned, barely a year before. The pattern was there, but no one wanted to name it. Not yet. Not while the grief was still raw. But fans felt it. Reporters whispered. And as Janis was laid to rest, the number 27 began to take on a life of its own. A curse, a sentence, a shadow hanging over the brightest stars. Even now, decades later, the questions linger. Did Janis Joplin truly fall to her own demons? Or was she pulled into something bigger, something none of us can fully see? Was her death just another headline, or was it a warning? Her laughter, her heartbreak, her wild spirit, they still echo through her records. Listen closely, and it almost feels as though she never left. As though her voice still lives between the notes, waiting to be heard. But Janis's story is not only about loss. It is about the beginning of a pattern that would haunt music forever. She was not the last. The shadow that claimed her was already waiting for its next victim. Another legend. Another voice. Another 20-7. And when it came, it would strike. Not in Los Angeles, not in San Francisco, but across the ocean in the heart of Paris. The curse was far from over. It had only just begun. Janis Lynn Joplin was born on January 1943 in the small oil town of Port Arthur, Texas. At first glance, nothing about this quiet southern town suggested that it could give birth to a voice so wild, so raw, that it would one day shake the world. But behind the calm streets and the uniform houses lay a girl who never truly belonged. She was restless, fiery, and hungry for something greater, something no small town could ever provide. From an early age, Janis knew she was different. Her classmates teased her for her looks, called her names for her acne-scarred skin, and rejected her for the way she dressed. In a world that worshipped conformity, Janis was a rebel. She painted her skirts, wore men's shirts, carried books of poetry, and walked with an intensity that unsettled those around her. She laughed louder, spoke sharper, and sang with a power that no one could ignore. But in those years, her difference made her an outcast. She often ate lunch alone. She kept her thoughts tucked inside notebooks. And deep down, she carried the ache of being misunderstood. Music became her only refuge. She immersed herself in the soulful voices of Bessie Smith, Leadbelly, and Odetta. She studied the blues as if it were scripture, listening to every crackle of the records that spun on her turntable. The music spoke to her, called to her, told her that she wasn't alone, that somewhere out there, in a wider world beyond Port Arthur, people lived loudly, sang fearlessly, and bared their souls without shame. But escaping Port Arthur wasn't easy. Her parents were strict, her town conservative, and the shadows of small-town gossip clung to her every move. Still, Janis was determined. She began singing in local bars, her raspy, aching voice cutting through cigarette smoke and beer-soaked floors. At first, people were startled. They had never heard a young white girl sing like that, with the raw soul of a blueswoman twice her age, with the pain of 100 lifetimes echoing in her lungs. Soon, whispers spread. This strange, wild girl could sing. And not just sing, she could command a room. But with every performance, Janis felt the pull of two worlds, the desire to shine and the fear of being crushed by the weight of her own insecurities. Offstage, she was vulnerable, plagued by self-doubt, haunted by the jeers of her childhood. On stage, she was untouchable, a force of nature. The duality tore at her spirit. To numb the ache, she began to drink. She experimented with pills. And slowly, the darkness that would one day consume her began to take root. In 1963, desperate for change, Janis packed her bags and fled Texas for California. San Francisco, with its wild colors, beat poets, and freedom-soaked streets, became her new home. Here, at last, she could breathe. She wore beads in her hair, colorful clothes that clashed on purpose, and sang in smoke-filled clubs where misfits gathered like moths to a flame. She was no longer the outcast. She was the fire everyone wanted to be near. But with freedom came temptation. The streets of San Francisco were not just alive with music, they were alive with drugs. And for someone as vulnerable as Janis, the line between liberation and destruction was dangerously thin. Friends would later recall nights where she'd sing like a goddess, then crumble in the corner, broken and trembling. The stage gave her life. The silence afterward hollowed her out. Then came 1966, the moment that changed everything. Janis was invited to join a new band, Big Brother and the Holding Company. They were a group of scruffy San Francisco musicians, blending psychedelic rock with raw energy. At first, some doubted Janis could keep up with the wild chaos of the band. But when she opened her mouth and sang, there was no question. She didn't just keep up, she stole the spotlight. Her voice, rough yet tender, soared above the guitars, a mix of anguish and ecstasy that no one had ever heard before. The audience were stunned. Some cried, some screamed, some just stood frozen. Janis had that effect. She reached inside you, ripped your heart open, and made you feel every wound, every joy, every piece of humanity you tried to hide. By 1967, during this summer of love, Janis Joplin was no longer just a girl from Texas. She was a rising star, a symbol of raw authenticity in a world drowning in polished pop stars. When she performed at the Monterey Pop Festival, belting out ball and chain with every ounce of her soul, the crowd went silent. Even the great mama cast of the Mamas and the Papas could be seen mouthing one word as she watched in awe: wow. That performance catapulted Janis into legend. Overnight, she went from an underground singer to one of the most talked-about performers in the country. Record labels wanted her. Journalists begged for interviews. Fans worshipped her. But behind the applause, the pressure grew. Fame was a double-edged sword, and Janis was about to discover just how sharp it could be. For every cheer that lifted her up, there was a night alone that dragged her down. She longed for love, but often found only heartbreak. She craved acceptance, but wrestled with the scars of rejection. The drugs became stronger, the drinking heavier, and the more the world adored her, the lonelier she became. her story was only just beginning. The fire was only starting to roar. But fires that burn brightest rarely burn long. And as Janis Joplin's star rose higher and higher, the shadows that followed her were waiting for their chance to strike. The night after Monterey Pop, Janis didn't sleep. She sat in a small hotel room, cigarette smoke curling around her as she replayed the screams of the audience in her head. For a girl once mocked and shunned, that roar of approval was intoxicating. It was proof that the pain she had carried all her life wasn't for nothing. But as she stared into the mirror, eyeliner smudged, hair wild, she whispered to herself, was it real? Or was it just one night? Janis was haunted by doubt. No matter how many fans praised her, no matter how many critics wrote that she had changed the face of rock music, a small voice inside her still repeated the words she had heard as a child. Ugly, weird, too much. It was that wound that gave her songs their power, but it was also the wound that would never fully heal. Her band, Big Brother and the Holding Company, rode the wave of success. They signed with Columbia Records, and soon their album Cheap Thrills was climbing the charts. The cover, a wild comic-style drawing by Arkrum, reflected the chaos inside. And inside that album was Janis's voice, raw, desperate, unstoppable. Songs like Piece of My Heart tore through the airwaves. America was stunned. Here was a woman singing not about perfect love, not about fairy tales, but about real bruising heartbreak. She sang as if she had lived 1,000 broken romances, and in truth, she had lived enough pain to know doubt, but behind the scenes, Janis was unraveling. Fame brought money, and money brought more access to the very things that numbed her pain. The heroin, once occasional, became frequent. The bottles of Southern Comfort were no longer for taste. They were for survival. On stage, she was a hurricane. Off stage, she was a woman collapsing under her own storm. Friends tried to help. Some begged her to slow down, to take a break, to let her voice rest. But Janis lived as if she knew her time was short. She laughed louder than anyone, partied harder than anyone, sang until her throat bled. To her, the idea of holding back was worse than death itself. She once said, "On stage, I make love to 25,000 people, and then I go home alone." That loneliness was her truest curse stopped by 1969. Janis had left Big Brother and formed her own group, the Cosmic Blues Band. She wanted to push her sound further, blending soul and blues with rock. But the critics were divided. Some said she was losing her edge, others that her band wasn't strong enough to carry her voice. Janis, sensitive as always, felt the sting of every review. She wanted to be loved, not just cheered for on stage, but truly loved, accepted, understood. And yet, every attempt to find that love ended in heartbreak. Lovers left her, used her, betrayed her. The cycle repeated, feeding the pain that fueled her songs, but also digging the hole deeper. Woodstock came in August 1969, and with it, another chance to prove herself. But when Janis walked onto that stage, high and shaking, her performance faltered. She sang with her whole heart, as always, but she knew it wasn't her best. When the applause came, it felt hollow. She walked off stage with tears in her eyes, convinced she had failed. For most, Woodstock was a triumph. For Janis, it was another wound. Her friends saw the cracks widening. Some nights, she was radiant, cracking jokes, lighting up every room. Other nights, she was a ghost, eyes empty, body slumped in the corner with a needle by her side. She was slipping between worlds, between glory and destruction. And yet, even as her demons grew louder, so did her legend. Fans adored her. They painted murals of her face, carried her records everywhere, and shouted her lyrics in the streets. To them, Janis was untouchable. To Janis, she was one wrong step away from disappearing forever. Janis Joplin's life was a contradiction wrapped in music. On stage, she was fearless. Off stage, she was fragile. She had the world in her hands, yet she always seemed to carry a loneliness she could never set down. Fame gave her adoration, but never belonging. She could make a crowd of thousands feel her pain, yet go home to an empty room with only silence to keep her company. The night of October 4th, 1970, silence won. Or so they say. The official reports told us the story was simple too simple. A dose too strong, a drink too many, a heart that could not take the weight. But what about the cigarette she never lit? What about the plans she spoke of just hours earlier? What about the rumors that her dealer disappeared into the night, vanishing as quickly as she did? A woman who had survived so much loneliness, heartbreak, addiction, ridicule was gone in a moment. And yet, even as fans grieved, questions began to rise. Why 27? Why her? Why now, just 16 days after Hendrix's death? Two legends, both gone before 30, both carrying music that felt larger than life itself. For many, Janis's passing was more than coincidence. It felt like destiny, or worse, design. Some said she was a victim of the very culture that adored her, chewed up and spat out by an industry that thrives on bright lights and broken souls. Others whispered of darker forces, the curse of 27, the shadow that follows. Artists who give too much of themselves, too quickly, too young. And then came the theories that her heroine was poisoned, that she was silenced to stop her from speaking out, that she knew too much, that she was never meant to survive the fame she carried. In death, Janis became more than a singer. She became a symbol, a warning, proof that the brightest flames do not burn the longest. They burn the hottest, and they burn out before we are ready to let them go. Her grave in Port Arthur may mark her resting place, but her voice still moves like a ghost through time. Every time her records spin, every time her cry shakes through the speakers, it feels like she's still here, just out of reach. A reminder that the soul doesn't die with the body, it lingers, restless, searching. And that restlessness is what gave birth to the legend of the 27 Club. A curse, a pattern, a question that refuses to fade. Janis Joplin did not die alone in that hotel room. She was joined by those who came before her and by those who would soon follow. Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse. The number is the same. The story is the same. The silence is the same. Janis was not the beginning, and she was not the end. She was a chapter in a darker book, one written in whispers and shadows, one still being written even now. And as her voice fades into the night, we are left with only questions. Did Janis Joplin fall victim to her own demons? Or was she pulled into something far greater, something unseen, something that music itself cannot explain? The story of Janis Joplin is over, but the story of the 27 Club is only beginning. As 1970 approached, Janis was at a crossroads. She had started work on what would become her most powerful album yet, Pearl. For the first time, she had a band that matched her intensity, the Full Tilt Boogie Band. The songs were sharper, her voice more controlled, and the fire inside her was refined into something almost transcendent. She felt for a moment that she was finally finding her balance, that maybe the chaos could settle. Maybe she had a future after all, but fate had other plans. And in the autumn of 1970, the shadows that had chased her since childhood were ready to strike for the final time. The year was 1970, and for Janis Joplin, it felt like a second chance. After years of chaos, heartbreak, and the whirlwind of fame, she had finally found a band that truly fit her. The Full Tilt Boogie Band wasn't Just a backup group, they were her equals, her partners, her musical family. Together, they created something electric, something alive, something that felt like it could heal the wounds inside her. Janis threw herself into the work. In the studio, she was relentless. She demanded take after take, not out of ego, but out of desperation. She wanted perfection, not the glossy perfection of pop records, but the perfection of truth. She needed every note, every scream, every crack in her voice to be real. She wasn't singing songs. She was bleeding them out, pouring every drop of her soul into the microphone. The engineers said they had never seen anything like it. Some nights, she left the studio drenched in sweat, shaking, tears still streaking her cheeks. For the first time in years, there was hope. Her new album, what would later be called Pearl, was shaping up to be her masterpiece. Songs like Me and Bobby McGee carried a freedom and a tenderness that surprised even her closest friends. It was as if she had finally found the balance between the hurricane and the calm, the scream and the whisper. For once, Janis seemed to believe she might survive the storm, but the storm was never far away. Even as she worked, the old demons clawed at her. The heroine still called to her in the quiet hours. The bottle of Southern Comfort still waited by her bed. Friends tried to pull her back, begged her to quit, to save herself. Some nights, she swore she would. She flushed the drugs, promised to start fresh, to hold on to the light. Other nights, she disappeared into hotel rooms with strangers, chasing the high that dulled the emptiness inside. Her need for love remained her greatest wound. She could sing to thousands, yet when the lights dimmed and the crowd vanished, she returned to empty beds and unanswered calls. She fell hard and fast for men who never stayed, for promises that dissolved with the morning sun. The loneliness was unbearable, and the drugs filled the space where love should have been. Still, when she stepped on stage, none of that showed. Audiences saw only the wild, radiant goddess, barefoot and untamed, screaming into the microphone as if she were possessed. They didn't see the trembling hands backstage, the nervous laughter, the fragile girl who once sat alone in a Texas high school cafeteria. By September 1970, the album was nearly finished. Her band was tight, her voice at its peak, and for once, her career seemed unstoppable. She spoke to friends about the future, about tours, about maybe even settling down. Some said she was happier than they had ever seen her. Others, more quietly, saw the cracks that never fully healed. Then came October. The sessions continued, day after day, night after night. Janis pushed herself harder, recording with a fire that seemed almost desperate. On October 3rd, she laid down what would become one of her most haunting tracks, Mercedes-Benz, a song recorded in one single take, a raw, a cappella prayer filled with sarcasm, humor, and a hidden loneliness. She laughed in the studio that night, joking with her bandmates. None of them knew it would be the last time they would ever hear her voice in that room. The next day, she didn't show up for her scheduled session. At first, no one was worried. Janis was unpredictable, always running late, always on her own time. But as the hours passed, a strange unease filled the studio. Calls went unanswered. Rumors began to spread. By evening, someone was sent to check on her. The door to her hotel room was locked. When it was finally opened, the truth spilled into the world like a dark, heavy shadow. Janis Joplin was found lifeless on the floor beside her bed. A needle lay close by. Her body was still, her spirit gone. She was 27 years old. The world would later call it an overdose. Heroin, mixed with alcohol, had taken her final breath. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered it was inevitable, that the curse of the 27 Club had claimed another soul. But for those who knew her, the loss was more than a headline. It was the silence of a voice that could never be replaced. In the days that followed, grief. hung heavy in the air. Fans wept in the streets. Fellow musicians stood in stunned disbelief. How could someone so alive, so fierce, so unstoppable, be gone? But beneath the grief was another feeling, an eerie sense of connection. Just 16 days earlier, Jimi Hendrix, another fiery spirit, had died at 27. Now Janis was gone too. Two legends, two flames extinguished in the same season. The whispers grew louder. Something dark was at play. But the story of Janis Joplin doesn't end here. For in her death came more mysteries, more questions, more shadows that refused to fade. And what happened in the final hours of her life? The unanswered calls, the missing people, the strange details in that hotel room would leave the world forever. Wondering, did Janis Joplin really die from an accident? Or was there something far more sinister behind her final night? The details of Janis Joplin's final night remain clouded in shadows. On the evening of October 3rd, 1970, she was in good spirits, or so it seemed. Friends said she laughed, talked about the future, and even seemed proud of how the recording sessions were going. They were plans for the next day. Nothing about her demeanor suggested that within hours, she would be gone forever. Yet, sometime after midnight, the chain of events began to twist into something darker. Reports say Janis returned to her room at the landmark Motor Hotel in Hollywood, carrying change from a late-night errand. She stopped at the front desk, exchanged a few coins for cigarettes, and walked back toward her room. Witnesses recall she seemed steady, maybe a little tired, but not distraught. The staff would later remember her last moments of being seen. Alive as ordinary, hauntingly ordinary. But when her body was discovered the next evening, the scene raised unsettling questions. She had collapsed near her bed, still in her nightgown. A fresh cigarette lay unlit beside her, as if she hadn't even had the chance to strike the match. A needle was nearby, and investigators concluded that heroin was the cause. Yet those closest to her insisted the dosage she used was not out of the ordinary for her tolerance. Some whispered that a bad batch of heroin had circulated through Los Angeles that week, claiming multiple lives. But others, they weren't so sure. Why had her dealer vanished almost immediately after her death? Why were some of her personal belongings mysteriously missing from the room? And why did friends who spoke to her just hours before swear she was upbeat, even excited about what lay ahead? The timeline itself became a riddle. Some claimed she died in the early morning. Others insisted it was later that afternoon. The official reports left gaps that fed suspicion. There were even rumors that she had tried to make a phone call in those final moments, a call that was never connected. Who was she trying to reach? And why did no one answer? The more investigators dug, the more questions arose. Was Janis truly a victim of her own vices, or was she the victim of something else? Something unseen, something that lurked in the background of the music world. The eerie fact that Hendrix had died just weeks before, also at 27, gave birth to whispers of a curse. A pattern, a shadow stalking the brightest stars of a generation. And as the world mourned, fans began asking the question that still echoes today. Was Janis Joplin's death really an accident? Or was there someone or something that wanted her silenced forever? The answers remain elusive. Some point to the drugs, others to the pressures of fame. And a few claim the truth is far stranger than we dare to believe, because after Janis, the pattern did not stop. The curse of 27 was only just beginning to take its toll. Janis Joplin's death should have been the end of a single tragedy, but instead, it was the second strike in what would soon be called a pattern too eerie to ignore. Only 16 days earlier, Jimi Hendrix had been found lifeless in London, his voice silenced, his guitar strings forever still. Both he and Janis were just 27. Two of the brightest stars of their generation, gone within weeks of each other. The world reeled. To many, it felt as though music itself was under attack, as though some unseen hand had reached out to pluck its icons from the stage. The headlines spoke of overdoses, accidents, the reckless abandon of youth. But behind the words, the whispers grew louder. Fans traded theories. Friends cast uneasy glances. What were the odds that two legends, both at the height of their fame, would be struck down at the exact same age? And then, less than a year later, Jim Morrison, another wild spirit, another voice of a generation, was gone. Paris, 1971. I'm 27 years old. The curse, people said, had claimed another victim. The number began to take on a life of its own. 27. It was more than an age, it became a symbol, a warning, a dark omen stamped on the pages of rock and roll history. Some said it was a coincidence. Others said it was fate. A few whispered of bargains struck in the shadows, deals made with forces too dark to name Dot, and Janis Joplin, with her soulful cry and untamed heart, was forever bound to that myth. Her death was no longer just her own. It was part of a greater story. A story that would continue to claim more names, more lives, more legends. But what if it wasn't only drugs, or fame, or reckless living? What if the truth behind the 27 Club was darker and far more intentional? Because after Morrison, after Janis, after Hendrix, there were still more to come. The curse was far from finished. And soon, it would circle back to claim yet another star in ways just as sudden and just as suspicious.